When you think of people living in poverty, who do you envision? Trailer parks, ghettos, missing teeth, hillbillies, rednecks, welfare queens, cheap clothes, fake labels, beat-up cars, poorly maintained houses, dead lawns, dirty kids, fraud, crime, violence. What images does the word poverty conjure for you? My name is Kristen Sewell. I'm the Director of Content Production for Michigan Health Council. I have a degree in sociology and advanced degrees in anthropology from Michigan State University. I taught courses on biocultural evolution, gender identity, race, archaeology, and I'm published on those topics as well. I served a year in AmeriCorps before joining MHC in 2017. I worked on eliminating poverty for people living in rural Michigan. I grew up in poverty in a single-parent household. My mother came from the Ozarks, and she lived a pretty hardscrabble life. All of my ancestors were sharecroppers in that region, so poverty is personal to me. You'll notice I use the term people living in poverty. It's a people-first statement that is a linguistic speed bump that will help you to remember that you're talking about real people with real lives and real feelings. I hope you'll adopt that kind of language whenever you're talking about a marginalized group. So first, let's talk about class. Are you middle class? Is middle income the same as middle class? What is class anyway? Middle class can include things like income, of course, but it can also include college education, white-collar work, economic security, owning a home, or having certain social and political values. Class could also be a state of mind. That is, it could be a matter of self-identification. It's kind of funny, a lot of people believe they're middle class. The very rich and the very poor claim to be middle class. Everyone knows someone richer or poorer than themselves. The image shown here depicts middle income, which is defined by the Pew Research Center as those with an income that is 67% to 200% of the overall median household income after incomes have been adjusted for household size. But because income level and class aren't often in sync, we don't need to see paycheck stubs to make judgments about class. How do you make judgments about class? Are there words you use to classify people? In Michigan, 15% of the population lives in poverty. The nationwide statistic is 11.8%. Notice the deepest poverty isn't just in Detroit, Flint, or Lansing. It's in rural Michigan. I'll be using data from Poverty USA a lot going forward, but the data are from 2018, before the pandemic. It's worse now. As of this writing, January 2021, because of COVID-19, there are approximately 13.6 million people out of work in the United States. This video isn't about temporary situational poverty, although temporary poverty can easily turn into long-term poverty or even permanent poverty, especially when you live near the financial edge. When there are circumstances like natural disasters, a stock market crash, economic recession, a Great Depression, war, or a global pandemic like the one we're in now, people tend to pull together. We recognize the external circumstances affecting a person's or family's wealth status. We acknowledge that poverty isn't a moral failure and has nothing to do with character or work ethic. When poverty is generational, however, it's not so easily understood or empathized with. Words like lazy, handouts, takers, welfare queen, bum, deadbeat, ghetto, and trash get thrown around. That's what I want to talk about today. The bias against people who are living in poverty, long-term, permanent, generational poverty. These graphs represent the portions of those populations living in poverty. So of all the children in the United States, 16.2% lived in poverty in 2018. That's nearly 1 in 6 kids. What you should know here is that individuals fit into more than one category, which complicates things. For example, men raising children alone live in poverty at the same rate as women of any category, 12.7%. Women raising children alone live in poverty as much as a person of color of any category, 24.9%. So imagine what your likelihood of living in poverty is if you're an indigenous woman raising children alone, and if you're also a senior citizen raising your grandchildren, and then add in a disability on top of that. Poverty is violent. It's a slow and prolonged assault on the body. Poverty is a public health crisis that affects every sector and system in American life. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a simple tool used in psychology. Each category is motivational. Meeting one set of needs or not meeting them acts as a motivator. The lower 4 levels are often referred to as the deficiency needs. Many people achieve the first 4 levels with ease. Most of us have our basic physiological needs met, feel safe in our homes, have loving friends and family, and accomplish basic goals like graduating high school, getting a job, getting married, and having children. The top tier is the growth need. Those are about fulfilling your promise and living up to your potential, having the time and resources to be artistic or creative, going to college or graduate school, getting your book published, making manager or climbing your way to the C-suite, sending your kids to college, travel, finding inner peace and tranquility, becoming self-actualized. To be clear, the needs all occur concurrently. The need for love doesn't just appear once all physiological needs are met. The need for family doesn't disappear if you find yourself living in poverty. Public health uses a different term and generally refers to the health impacts of poverty as social determinants of health. Thinking about social determinants, we see economic stability, neighborhoods and the built environment, intellectual stimulation and growth, access to quality health care, and healthy interpersonal relationships and connection to community. There's some overlap between public health and psychology, but it boils down to health being fulfilled by meeting both physiological and psychological needs. People living in poverty have a hard time meeting basic needs, which impacts their ability to meet the needs in other tiers. What does that look like? People who live in poverty suffer food shortages or limited access to nutritional food, hunger, substandard shelter, and are vulnerable to slumlords, eviction, and homelessness. Children living in poverty are more likely to lack electricity, heat, water, and the creature comforts most of us take for granted in winter, like warm blankets and bedding, winter coats, gloves or mittens, and warm socks. Harder to see, at least from the outside, are the psychological impacts. Sleeping soundly, knowing your home and neighborhood is safe, knowing there's a paycheck coming, knowing there's food in the fridge, having clean, weather-appropriate clothes, feeling comfortable buying whatever you like at the grocery store, knowing the lady behind you won't judge you because you're using food stamps, knowing you won't be bullied or laughed at because the hot water was shut off and you couldn't bathe. If you're constantly worried about food and shelter, it's pretty unlikely you're going to be focused on becoming self-actualized. People make a lot of assumptions about people using public assistance. One assumption is that people on welfare are lazy, shiftless, and looking for loopholes to bilk the welfare system wherever they can. This is Lucinda Taylor. She is the original welfare queen, a racist trope to be sure, who committed welfare fraud and insurance fraud and identity theft, possibly kidnapping, possibly even murder. She was a dangerous criminal. She does not represent the vast majority of fraud in the welfare system. She was found to have many checks made out to many other people in her possession. She basically committed identity theft and used those identities to collect welfare. She was a serious criminal. She was used as a symbol of welfare fraud, but then eventually the term welfare queen morphed into a term used to describe anyone, but mostly black women, who collect welfare. There's also this sense that these women also have babies to keep the money rolling in. On average, welfare recipients receive about $25 per day. In fact, most states require people on public assistance to be employed, unless they're elderly, disabled, or doing the caregiving for small children, or elderly or disabled family members, unpaid labor that frequently falls to women. So who are the people on public assistance? Well, 62% are white or a race other than black, 93% of one-parent families on assistance are female head of household, so single moms. 93% don't have a college degree. 18% didn't graduate high school. 86% are renters, and 31% don't own a car. So the person most represented by these numbers is a white woman with children, working an entry-level or low-skill job, renting an apartment, and using public transportation. Is this who you think of when you think of people on public assistance? So remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're still talking about basic physiological necessities: food, shelter, medicine. There's a myth about poverty and crime too. It goes something like this: when there's an economic downturn, crime rates increase. People living in poverty commit more crime. And we hear this idea repeatedly in narratives like the welfare queen we just talked about, or wanting to test people on welfare for illicit drugs. We imagine people stealing because they can't afford luxuries, or robbing houses or liquor stores for quick cash. Historically, when poverty goes down, the rate of property crimes actually goes up. Why is that? Analysts have been trying to solve that paradox for 100 years. They suggest there's no direct correlation between the economy and crime rates, yet we still associate property crime with poverty. Why is that, do you think? One reason is that people living in poverty have more encounters with law enforcement. In fact, people who live in poverty are more likely to be victims of crime and are more likely to be incarcerated for having committed crimes. There are an estimated 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States. 500,000 are drug offenders, and half of those are nonviolent drug offenders. More than 500,000 are pretrial detainees, which means that they have not had a bail hearing, or they had a bail hearing and couldn't afford bail to get out of jail. 143,000 are homeless, and a quarter of those are arrested for activities related to their homelessness, like panhandling. 50,000 are in jail for non-payment of child support. And then there's a whole host of others who are incarcerated for non-payment of fines. The United States has more people incarcerated than any other developed country in the world. And how many of those people are incarcerated simply because they couldn't afford to get out of jail? Cash bail is a significant barrier for people who are living in poverty who get accused of crime. Nearly 1/5 of people accused of crime are detained without a trial because they can't afford bail. The graphic shows how of those who can't afford bail, the vast majority, 81% of them, are living in deep poverty. These pre-trial detainees will eventually get their day in court, and most of them will go back to jail or prison because of public defenders and plea deals. 80% of defendants are represented by public defenders, where they get to spend, on average, 1 hour with their lawyer. Almost all, 90 to 95% of those clients will accept a plea bargain. The system incentivizes either accepting a sentence of time served or overcharging to give the prosecutors bargaining leverage. So let's say you're charged with a minor drug offense and you're offered a plea deal and you accept it. You just want to go home. Your public defender didn't mention anything about collateral consequences. How will having a drug-related criminal record impact your life? You've lost your job while you were detained, and your car, because without a job you have failed to make your car payments. You can't afford your apartment, you're going to have to move. You're no longer eligible for public assistance, including public housing. You have to make declarations on job applications and rental applications. But maybe you want to go back to trade school and get a certificate. Well, you have a drug record, so you might not be able to get a student loan. Even if you do get a certificate, if your career path requires a background check or occupational licensure with the state, like a barber, hairstylist, certified nursing assistant, child care worker, you may be ineligible. The American Bar Association published a report stating that formerly incarcerated men take home 40% less pay than they did before they went to prison. So let's revisit the crime-poverty paradox. Why do we associate high crime with people living in poverty? Well, it's a bias. It's a bias against people living in poverty, and it's a bias largely also against people of color. If a large percentage of the people languishing in our prisons are people who were living in poverty, it only is logical that it's because those people commit more crimes. The reality is, when poor people get charged with a crime, guilty or not, it has lifelong catastrophic consequences. If you want to see the ways our criminal justice system favors the wealthy and well-connected, just do a quick Google search of celebrity mugshots and you'll see what I mean. How many celebrities have crossed paths with the police only to bounce right back and suffer almost no consequences? You don't have to be a celebrity, though. This is Ethan Couch. His lawyer argued that he suffered from affluenza, a condition where, because he was wealthy all of his life and had never really suffered any consequences, he failed to learn the difference between right and wrong and shouldn't be held accountable for his mistakes now. His mistake was vehicular manslaughter. He was drunk driving and killed several people and permanently paralyzed another. Or Brock Turner, the Stanford University student who was accused of 3 felony sex crimes. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail. He served 3. His father argued to the judge that his life would never be the one that he dreamed about and worked so hard to achieve. That isn't to say that people living in poverty never commit crime. Of course they do. But if the Bureau of Justice Statistics is correct, and 80% of all defendants use a public defender, that means that 80% of all defendants are indigent. And that doesn't sound like equal justice under the law. And when people living in poverty enter the justice system, the consequences are lifelong. There is no bouncing back. So poverty is violent. It hurts people. Let's talk about working class work. Maybe you've heard this before. Do you shower before work or after work? If you shower before work, it means you have a clean job, a office job, a white-collar job. If you shower after work, you're blue-collar or pink-collar and probably work a dirty job. Mainly, you labor for your paycheck. You do America's hardest work. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the sectors with the most workplace injuries are construction and resource extraction, manufacturing, transportation, the service industries, and healthcare. People of color are overrepresented in the military, as are people from rural communities. People from wealthy families are much less likely to take up military service than their lower class peers. Does that mean wealthy people are less inclined to serve their country or are less patriotic than other classes? No, of course not. It does suggest, however, entry or maintenance in the middle class is an incentive for military service. Training, reliable income, opportunity for travel, programs to help with home ownership, educational assistance, and healthcare are valuable incentives. This means that most casualties of war, that is, people who are killed in action, missing in action, physically injured, or psychologically affected by their service, are middle class, people living in poverty, and people of color. The American ideal of shared sacrifice is not equally distributed and not shared across class lines. A study out of Boston University in 2016 goes so far as to call this phenomenon invisible inequality and argues that 21st century wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are wars fought almost entirely by the working class. I want to be clear, however, the GI Bill, enacted after World War II, was intentionally designed to accommodate Jim Crow laws. So there's a gap in the history of the GI Bill where it didn't benefit people of color at all. That exclusion is evident in America's racial wealth gap and has affected generations of African Americans in particular. Poverty isn't a blue-collar or white-collar issue. Not all white-collar workers are wealthy and not all blue-collar workers are poor. Hardly. In fact, people who work in the trades like welders, nurses, mechanics, and plumbers make pretty decent wages. And when you compare that to people who took on mountains of education debt only to make low to middle class income, the trades are doing pretty good. In fact, nearly half of all Americans worry on a daily basis about losing their job. And more than half of all Americans live paycheck to paycheck, which means that half of Americans are just one unforeseen expense away from financial catastrophe. And people who work in the gig economy are even more at risk because their jobs lack stability, predictability, reliable income, security, health insurance, retirement planning, or any benefits whatsoever. So when I say poverty is an assault on the body and a public health crisis, this is what I mean. People living in poverty are less able to flee natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina in 2005, or more recently Hurricane Maria in 2017, and are more likely to lose their lives, their bodies, because of it. People who live in poverty are more likely to suffer preventable and treatable diseases. They're more likely to have diabetes and heart conditions, and they're more likely to die because of lack of health care. They're more likely to have to choose between medicine and food or shelter. They're more likely to live without access to healthy foods. They're more likely to be obese. They're more likely to smoke and use drugs or alcohol. People living in poverty are subjected to people judging what they do with their bodies, how they eat, who they have sex with, and how many sex partners they have. People living in poverty become accustomed to negotiating over their own bodily autonomy, as if because they're poor, they don't have the right or capacity even to make sound decisions for themselves. It's dehumanizing. In 2017, CityLab published an essay from the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society and the American Enterprise Institute, in which they argued against othering people living in poverty. The process of othering, they wrote, uses bonds of shared identity to deny empathy and a sense of belonging to others. It gives elites and dominant groups an excuse to see social problems as distant pathologies, rather than soluble crises affecting people who are like them. Othering the poor will only cease when we acknowledge the truth. They are us, and we all belong together. Do you recall the black and white video clip with the kids in Appalachia playing in their front yard? Or maybe you read J.D. Vance's best-selling book, Hillbilly Elegy, or saw the movie on Netflix. That's what a lot of people think of when they think of poverty. They envision an other world. But in reality, poverty is all of us. Half the country is on the precipice, worried about losing their job, living paycheck to paycheck. It's every other person on your street. So that's the implicit bias, that poverty happens to other people. Thank you for viewing this video. Please view some of our other content on implicit bias that includes topics such as body size, gender, sexuality, and race. Thank you.